All right. So welcome everyone to our 15th virtual town hall on modern monetary theory and the people's economy. My name is Edison Gomez-Krauss. I'm filling in for Tisa Rodriguez today. So first of all, I want to welcome everyone who's joining us on Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, Zoom, and YouTube. Just so everybody knows, everyone on Zoom will be muted. You may ask your questions in the chat and they will be forwarded to the panelists. The same goes for Twitch, Twitter, and Facebook. You may ask your questions in the chat. So without further ado, I would like to present our guest today. First of which is, give me a second here. I've lost our guest. Here we go. Liam Amara. Liam Amara is a history professor from a working class family of union laborers. Liam has worked as a union longshoreman, union fry cook, and a computer nerd. He later took on a lot of student debt to finish his PhD. Liam has taught college for 12 years and focuses on the history of ideas. Liam is a Democratic nominee for U.S. Congress in the 42nd Congressional District in Southwest Riverside County. And today's guest is Fadhel Kaboub. Fadhel is an associate professor of economics at Edison University and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He has held research affiliations with the Levy Economics Institute in New York and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is an expert on modern monetary theory, the Green New Deal, and the Jobs Guarantee. His work focuses on public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global South, build resilience, and promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. He is working on a case for colonial and climate reparations as core features as the global Green New Deal. Liz Lavertu and Kate Schwartz unfortunately cannot join us today, but they will be here next time around. So let's kick this off with Liam. The floor is yours.
Okay, so hello again, Liam O'Mara for Congress and CD42. Welcome back. This week we have a special guest who is taking the time to walk you through one of the most important economic ideas around, one that explains what a lot of others cannot, reflects the reality that we already live in, even though the pundits, the media, politicians would prefer to keep spinning the same old lies about it. It also lets us abolish poverty, rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, and prepare for climate change, but only if we stop swallowing the nonsense in many mainstream political discussions of economics. It's time, I would say, to stop listening to think tanks funded by billionaires and look at what the data tell us. We, the American people, are being screwed out of the riches our government is producing every year. It is literally pumping money into the hands of the already rich when it could be stimulating the real economy, helping more of us start businesses, pay the rent, afford healthcare, and so on. But I'll tell you straight up, I was afraid to have this conversation when I got into this race. In fact, initially I threw a bone to conservative sentiment on government spending by suggesting we could address most public policy issues by shifting resources in our already bloated budgets and putting taxes back where they used to be. I felt I was already asking a lot of people by challenging their beliefs on the insurance industry, beliefs on the defense budget and the like, and that maybe this is a bridge too far. But what it actually is a linchpin holding together the entire vision that I have for America. And it really can't be ignored if the rest is going to work. And I think that there's a real hunger lately for fresh ideas and a willingness to take up the challenge of our present circumstances. And besides, tolerating misinformation in one area and not in others is basically a betrayal of my own values. And it took me a bit to realize what I was doing. The simple fact is we probably can't do all that we need to do by shifting the cash around, and we shouldn't even try. In some cases, in fact, balancing the budget even harms the economy. Clinton's move to do so contributed directly to the crash that Bush made inevitable with his tax cuts. So what I want in my introduction here is to give, I guess, a layman's introduction to the idea and point out how we can use it to make this economy work for everyone. And I'll leave a lot of the complex details to Dr. Kaboub. So I guess first, what is MMT? The shortest answer I can give you is that modern monetary theory is a new way of thinking about how money and the economy actually work, which asks us to understand that the government's job is more to stimulate the real economy, not to punish it with austerity. But for all the new in it, MMT is still rooted in all the same elements we've been using to discuss the economy for centuries. It seems more radical than it really is and simply takes into account how things are actually working, not how someone thinks they should be working. And after all, don't we want our big models to be empirically sound? Shouldn't public policy follow the evidence? I mean, we've let ourselves be snookered by fairy tales like trickle down supply side stuff and neoliberalism long enough. It's time to really follow the evidence. The first thing to do with it is to let go of this perverse idea that budgets in countries with sovereign currencies are anything like a household budget. In fact, the way that we budget and the way taxes and the like impact us are different from both governments and corporations. All three serve very different functions in the economy, and pretending that the same ideas work on all three is kind of how we got into a lot of this long-term stagnation. A lot of people know on some level what is a fiat currency, i.e. that it's not pegged to the value of some item like gold, but increasingly we're forgetting the value of that for ordinary people, which has really frequently frustrated me over the years, so that people all over the internet today are repeating bankers' propaganda from the 19th century when we first fought a populist battle to reduce the value of the dollar by pegging it to silver instead. The idea then was to cut the debt burden on farmers and small businesses, which it would have done. I mean, think for a minute about where we are. With consumer debt higher than at any time in history, if every dollar you owed was suddenly worth several times its current value, how would that affect you? Now, we finally got off the gold standard in the 1970s for reasons I'm going to completely set aside here. And I want instead to note how fiat currencies work a little bit from an MMT perspective. But in a way, I guess it gets to the whole money concept. I mean, has anyone ever asked themselves like why gold was even valuable? I mean, it's not especially scarce, but certainly more so than iron and the like. It was a choice made in the ancient world based upon what they had to hand. The first currencies were hunks and bars of cheaper metals, but these are kind of heavy to move around. So the Lydians had the idea of using a prettier but less common metal that was otherwise not needed for war or industry or anything else. So we created coinage. Essentially, gold and silver were chosen for this because they don't corrode, they're fairly light, and they're not useful for much of anything else besides maybe jewelry. The value is pragmatic and based on an ideal of simplicity. Paper currencies, likewise, have no real value on their own. They're practical and light, and even more so when they're just ones and zeros in a computer. But that's really it. What makes the dollar valuable is a shared belief in its value and in its relation to a stable government. It's essentially just an idea. And realistically, it's a myth that the government needs our money at all to pay its bills. It already has a responsibility and a right to mint the currency, which makes it essentially self-sustaining as long as there is sufficient exchange in that currency to generate real value and slow the inflationary effects of making cash. So the goal of taxation really is to set that value for us and to motivate our work, which is the real foundation of the economy. I think that economist Stephanie Kelton, she has a fun story that I think addresses it nicely. So I'm going to tell just a simple variation on it. Say you want your kids to do chores around the house and you offer to pay them using your business cards. Hard to imagine they'd be pretty motivated to mow the lawn by that, right? Because like, who cares? They're business cards. But if you told them that at the end of every week, they had to pay you a certain number of your business cards or they would lose video game privileges, now the cards have value. If you don't do chores during the cards, you can't pay the tax, you lose something you want. We pay taxes because the government wants its currency to circulate and to have value. It wants to make sure we're working and buying and selling things because that activity is the real economy. When the government spends more than it takes in taxes, it's not really a deficit in the way we tend to think, certainly not in the way it would affect us. And it's not really debt either. It's essentially the production and circulation of legal tender in a virtuous circle that stimulates growth. I mean, think of it this way. If you spend money, someone makes money, right? I mean, pretty basic concept. So imagine the government takes in exactly as much as it needs in taxes to pay its bills. The result is a balanced budget, which can be a good thing if all the other features of the economy are working. What MMT asks us to do is to think of economic outcomes in the whole economy and in the real economy, not just in the budget. And you may have noticed, especially if you tune into this every week and hear me ranting about these things, We have problems. I mean, the middle class is shrinking, debt's been climbing, fewer people can afford homes and healthcare. You may have noticed that the outcomes are a little bit out of whack. If the government decides to spend $1,000 but takes in only 900 in taxes, what it does is it's not really borrowing the way we would borrow. It's simply creating treasury bills for the rest. It's creating the money. But here's the kicker. It's taken 900 from us and spent 1,000, which means there's an extra $100 floating around in the economy that was not there before. So remember, anything that is spent is someone else's gain. So if the government spends more than it taxes, it's literally giving away money. And it does this every single year. The problem is that much of what it's generating is gobbled up by the super rich. So great wealth is generated, but it's not usually going to us. The government is literally making money and giving it to billionaires. But the making of the money is not itself the problem. The problem is that the rich have been investing in propaganda to make us think government spending is the issue, when the problem is what the government is spending the money on. And no, we're not going to have to worry about an outcome like Argentina's default or Zimbabwe's hyperinflation or Greece's fall into austerity. None of those things apply to a sovereign currency in a country with a stable economy. All the fears around it are based in misinformation, whether it's deliberate or not. What makes the MMT model work is sane government policy, like a federal jobs guarantee, spending on infrastructure that benefits all of us. We've talked about infrastructure a number of times, and actually we will be next week too, which is great. Education, healthcare expenditures, all these sort of things that stimulate growth in the real economy. And as long as you're stimulating growth in the real economy, the inflation is not actually hurting us. And in some ways, it actually makes things easier, like with the burden of consumer debt. Now, I'm going to shut up here because I believe our esteemed guest is going to talk a lot more about how we can use MMT, how it really works, and how we can keep applying this into future weeks of our discussion. So I'm going to pass the mic over for a clearer picture of that and see where that goes.
All right, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub. Go ahead. No, Dr.
On this program, it looks like I'm muted.
You're good.
Sorry,
you're good.
Am I back on? Okay. Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for hosting this this town hall, and thanks for the nice introduction to the MMT framework. But most importantly, thank you for your honesty, for stating clearly to the audience what most candidates feel like going into a campaign on this particular question of money and how do we pay for things. And the advantage that we have today with literally dozens of progressive candidates who are not funded by super PACs or fossil fuel money is that candidates like you are increasingly, open to the idea of addressing this head on and not having to hide behind the veil of old ideas. And the key issue here that a lot of candidates face is that they're speaking to an audience, their constituents who know what money is from their personal perspective. They know how to spend responsibly, how to budget responsibly. They know how to balance their checkbook. And they expect their city officials to do the same with city tax revenues. They expect state officials to do the same with tax revenues at the state level. So city officials, state officials, they have to operate essentially in the same way as a household operates. They have to tax in order to spend. They can borrow up to a certain limit in order to pay for major infrastructure projects. But once you borrow, you have now a real financial burden, a real debt that the city or the state must pay for at some point in the future, usually with higher taxes or less spending, or a combination of both. That is absolutely true for individuals, for companies, for states and cities and municipalities. But once you move to the federal level, the national level, you recognize that the federal government doesn't operate in the same way as states or cities or individual households. The federal government is the sovereign issuer of the currency. So what MMT says, number one, recognize the difference between the issuer of the currency and the rest of us. Number two, recognize that the spending limit of the federal government is not constrained by tax revenues or borrowing capacity. It turns out that it's much larger than that. Number three, notice MMT never says that spending capacity is unlimited. We never say that, right? But it's limited by something very important to recognize and acknowledge and to tackle. And that real limit that stops the federal government from spending is the risk of inflation. I often joke and say MMTers are obsessed with the risk of inflation, unlike what most people say about MMT, that it's just about printing money. So what is the risk of inflation? What determines that limit? It turns out the risk of inflation is determined by two things. One is the productive capacity of the economy. Do we have enough skilled labor? Do we have enough technology and machines and tools and raw materials to build whatever we want to build? If the answer is yes, then that risk of inflation is not going to be a problem. But if we start running out of resources, then prices will start going up. The good news about that kind of inflation is that it's something we can deal with very well by producing more, right? Because productive capacity is producible. So it happens to create even more jobs in the process of building capacity, say for renewable energy, for sustainable agriculture, for healthcare and education and so on. We can train people. We can produce nurses and doctors and hospital equipment and so on. So that kind of inflation, we know how to deal with. We plan strategically to address those potential shortages. The other risk of inflation is really the one that campaigns like yours are really tackling head on, which is the risk of inflation that comes from corporate power, key players who have abusive market power, who can raise prices because they can, who can create artificial scarcity because they dominate the market. They can sabotage production, to use an ancient term in the economics profession. And that kind of inflation, of abusive market power type of inflation, we're not going to get rid of it by spending less and being conservative. We're going to get rid of it by taxing and regulating that market power out of existence. In other words, you make that market more democratic. And here, I mean, as I explain this, people are probably thinking of a couple of industries in the back of their minds. Think of the health insurance industry. Think of the pharmaceutical industry. Think of some big real estate developers around your state, around your district. That's what we're talking about. So in order to tackle that risk of inflation, you have to have 535 people in Washington, D.C. who are willing to do the work. They're lawmakers, right? That's in the name's description. Lawmakers, they make the laws, which include taxing and regulating abusive market behavior. So how are we going to do that, address that kind of inflation, if we have politicians who are brought to you by the super PACs, who are funded by Big Pharma and Wall Street and so on? So we have a very clear issue of too much money in politics, too much power and influence in the democratic process, in the legislative process. So in order for us to have these ambitious green energy programs, these ambitious healthcare programs, these ambitious educational programs, we have to open up that space for that spending by taxing and regulating abusive behavior. Not because we need their money or their permission to have solar panels or better healthcare or better education, but we have to tax them to reduce their influence in politics, to protect the democratic process, to protect democracy from oligarchy. We don't need money or permission from the insurance companies to provide universal health care, but we need to tax their market power away so we can actually do the things that most Americans want. And this is clear from all the public opinion surveys that we've seen over the last couple of years. Most Americans want universal health care. Most Americans want green jobs, but they've been told that we can't have that because we don't have the money. And we have to find the money somehow. And then we're trapped into this counterproductive logic from the mainstream perspective that says we have to tax Wall Street so we can have healthcare. We have to tax, fossil fuels so that we can have solar panels. And that logic is flawed, and it's actually counterproductive for us in the progressive movement, because that logic says if we want to have a very ambitious public health program, then we need to tax them even more, which means we need them to be more powerful and more, wealthier, so that we can have a little bit of their wealth to spend on these things. And by making them wealthier, you make them more powerful, you make them more influential in politics, so you'll never have your taxes to pay for anything. So that's why it's counterproductive. And MMT decouples that spending and taxing. It says we spend on the priorities because we care and because we want those things as a democratic society, but then we're going to tax these types of behaviors out of existence, not because we need their money or permission, but because we need to decarbonize. We need to reduce market power. We need to, reduce the power of the oligarchy and eliminate it. So those become then two very important functions. And all of a sudden, that fiscal spending space increases dramatically. Again, it's not unlimited, but increases dramatically and allows us to pay for universal healthcare, for education, and so on. And then to close with these opening remarks with an important reminder that most Americans in the last 3 or 4 months have finally recognized, and we shouldn't really waste this opportunity of public attention to what's happening in Washington, D.C., which is what happens with the CARES Act, for example. A few days before the CARES Act, a few weeks before the CARES Act, if you ask anybody in Washington, can we afford a Green New Deal? Why don't we have universal health care? Their number one answer is we can't afford it. It's too expensive. We have no money, right? We heard this from Republicans and Democrats and everybody in DC. All of a sudden, the pandemic hits, and we decide as a society the CARES Act is a priority. All of a sudden, trillions of dollars appear. 535 people in DC meet. They set a priority. They vote to approve the spending. All of a sudden, the spending happens. So we didn't tax anybody. We didn't borrow from anybody to pay for the CARES Act. We paid for the CARES Act by voting. 535 people voted majority approving the CARES Act. To amplify this point even more, right around the same time, we were getting close to April 15th when most people were supposed to pay their taxes to the federal government. What did the federal government say? We're pushing the deadline to July 15th. We don't even need your tax money. Not only did we say we're not taxing anybody, we're not borrowing from anybody, but also we said, and by the way, don't send us any tax money. We don't need it. Send it in July, right? So where did the money come from? It comes from the same source, the power of the purse that Congress has. And this is not unique to the CARES Act. This was not unique to World War II. This is not unique to any particular event. This is how the federal government always spends. What we're saying in the MMT academic community, we're saying the federal government has that power of the purse. It doesn't have unlimited spending capacity. It's limited by inflation. It needs to tax and regulate market power. It needs to build more productive capacity in strategic areas of the economy. And it needs to recognize that it has this authority across the board, not just for military budget, not just for tax cut, not just for the CARES Act, but for everything we as a democratic society decide is a priority. So that means for us, the public, recognizing the power that the federal government has and recognizing that we aspire, hopefully, to live in a democracy, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, we have to vote accordingly. We have to send 535 people to Washington, D.C., to use the power of the purse to serve the people. So a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not a government of the super PACs, by the pharmaceuticals, for Wall Street, right? And this is really what MMT does. It shines this bright light on the economics of how the federal government operates, and it ties it directly to corruption and influence of super PACs and corporate power in Washington, D.C. And we can't do this by just describing what MMT says about economics without shining that bright light on that inflation limit, which is primarily determined by too much market power, abusive pricing behavior, and as a result, corruption between public officials who are supposed to represent us, the people, and instead serve the interest of the super PACs.
All right, thank you, Fadhel. That was actually, you closed on something very important, because our first question plays off of that. It comes from Benjamin on Facebook. He says, how come it's so hard for Congress to establish a higher minimum wage if it's going to stabilize inflation?
Well, it's not that hard for Congress to establish a higher minimum wage. Again, like any other, bills, like any other bill, Congress, has the authority to set the standards. So I usually like to take us back to what happened during the emancipation transition, where society said, we're not going to accept slavery anymore, right? So we as a society said, you have to pay people for their hard work. You can't enslave people. And what did the slave owner say at the time? That doesn't work for me. That doesn't fit my business model. I'll go bankrupt if I have to pay people I have to pay people wages to pick cotton and do work. And what did the society say? Society said, well, you should go out of business, and somebody else will figure out a way to be productive, pay people decent wages, and take your market share, right? So there's a bluff that needs to be called there. For corporations who say, if you raise the wage, we'll all go bankrupt, right? So at the same time, there's nuances here. At the same time, you have to recognize that small businesses, they don't have the same capacity as Amazon or Walmart or any of the big box stores. So one of the things that we as a society can do, or the federal government can do, is to raise the wage as a mandate to a living wage, but exempt small businesses from FICA taxes, for example. So MMT says we're going to decouple the spending from taxing. So the FICA tax, for the most part, goes towards your Social Security retirement benefits. Remember, this is a federal program. The government doesn't need to tax working class people in order to provide them with decent living in their elderly days. This is a myth that we tax you as you work so we can provide you with the Social Security paycheck. And if you think about it carefully, what the Social Security Administration does today is we collect FICA taxes. We use that revenue to buy US Treasuries. So it's the federal government taxing the people, buying US Treasuries from itself, putting those US Treasuries in a Social Security trust fund, pays itself interest on that trust fund. And then when it comes time for paying benefits to retirees, the federal government spends the checks the same way we spend on anything else. So why this gimmick if the federal government doesn't really need tax revenues or interest payments to itself to provide a decent living for the elderly? So what we can do is exempt small businesses and lower income individuals from the heavy burden of FICA taxes. And that's, a 14-15% boost to wages from the get-go. That by itself can bring us pretty close to a living wage. So there's that one point about the minimum wage. Corporations, like Amazon, and they should pay decent wages and higher benefits because they afford it. As a matter of fact, you'll notice most of them in the last few years, they actually increased their minimum wage voluntarily, not because we forced them, but because they can. And they realized immediately. Walmart employees, for example, got a pay boost a couple of years ago. What do you think most Walmart employees did with their extra few dollars every day? They went around and shopped at Walmart. So this is the old saying that we have in the economics profession that says workers spend what they get and capitalists get what they spend. So Walmart is the capitalist here. Walmart pays its employees a little bit more per hour and is going to get what they spend back in sales from their employees. And workers typically spend all of their income buying stuff from companies like Walmart, companies like Amazon. So it's a win-win situation. So this idea that the minimum wage is going to hurt the economy is a false idea. It's been debunked in economic theory. And in practice, we know how to transition from a low-paying economy to a higher wage-paying economy without bankrupting the system. Case in point, slavery. We go from zero to paying people wages. It was a boom in economic activity. It was the right thing to do. It was the moral and ethical thing to do. And now we've been stuck with minimum wages that haven't moved, that haven't budged for decades now. We're not even catching up with cost of living and inflation. So we're facing a similar moral and ethical dilemma here. And it's unfortunate that we have, politicians and economists and pundits who say, well, we can't afford to transition to a better quality of life. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I can add a few pieces here directly to that, as well as bring it back around to the specific question about why Congress can't act on this, because they can, but they're choosing not to. And the reason that they're choosing not to is important. But as far as the business rhetoric on this, yeah, there's just countless case studies about this. Like McDonald's freaks out, oh, you can't tell us to pay more wages to our workers, or we'll have to close locations, we'll have to shut down. Well, then you actually do put in that minimum wage increase. And what happens? McDonald's hires more people and opens more locations, because when you give working class people money, they spend it. Mm-hmm. That's that Fordist logic I keep trying to bring back up, that we used to understand in this country, and is the reason that wages went up for a while with productivity. If you give workers more money, as you're making more money, they spend more money and everyone gets rich. But if you give that money only to a few people, it hurts all of us. And that really gets back to a core understanding we have to recover, that government left all on its own is going to be problematic for us. A command economy is not going to be terribly efficient, but the same thing is true with business. If you leave business all on its own, it's going to pursue short-term profit. It's not going to think of the system as a whole, and it's going to hurt us. It's the responsibility of government to think about the whole picture, the long-term effects, how it's going to affect ordinary people. And it's a job of business to make money for their shareholders and owners. If they work together, if we regulate the business effectively, we all can benefit from it. But if the more you pull away from that regulatory responsibility, the more you completely abdicate the responsibility of government to protect ordinary people and allow businesses to be predatory, the more they shift the entire economic logic to favor only their short-term bottom line, not how it's going to affect all of us. Better regulation actually leads to better growth rates overall. And that's a thing that we've seemed completely to have forgotten. And that really does get to the core question that Benjamin was asking. Why does Congress not act? There are two major problems here. There's two major reasons. One, they are a wholly owned subsidiary of the oligarchy. They're bought and sold. The corporations are basically paying for their votes, and they're going to pay for what's in their short-term interest. So tackling that corruption in Washington, really draining that swamp, is something we need to do. We need to get rid of those lobbyists. We need to get that dark money out of our politics. But the other problem is more complex and insidious. It's essentially the amount of propaganda that we're bombarded with. We have, in legal terms, in the US, one of the freest media markets in the world. It is the only industry directly mentioned in the Constitution and protected in it. We have a lot more freedom to say things. However, we have allowed massive corporate consolidation in media, which means effectively the American people are the most heavily propagandized population in the developed world, because a handful of corporations, and literally like a handful, like 5 of them, control about 85 to 90% of all the media we're consuming already. And even a lot of the ones that we don't, they're still funded by dark money and corporate interests. The Koch brothers founding a very small outlet to pump a little bit more of their information out there. Realistically, all of it still favors the interests of that same small business class. And if we can't tackle that level of propaganda that tells us these are the problems, this is the issue here, we need, you need to, the whole business, like job creators. I see this all the time. Hey, if you lower taxes on the rich, they'll create more jobs. And no, they don't. You're literally lowering the incentive for them to invest, because they're literally being incentivized to sit on their asses and make money. If you tax them harder, they have to work harder to make that money in the first place, which means they reinvest in their business, they reinvest in Americans. The logic is completely wrong, but it does favor the short-term benefit of the people pumping out that propaganda. So we have to tackle the money in Congress, the corruption that I'm always joking that these jokers shall be wearing NASCAR jackets listing their owners on them. We have to tackle that issue head on, and we have to tackle the corporate concentration in the media that favors all of these false narratives.
Liam, when the Trump tax cut was being debated, and your viewers can look this up on YouTube probably, the Wall Street Journal had a room full of top-level CEOs from corporate America, and they were having a conversation about tax cuts. And then the host from the Wall Street Journal, I can't remember his name, he asked them, who in this room will use the tax cuts to increase job creation? Raise your hand. Nobody in the room. So they know this. This is just a myth. And your point about the media is really important, because when we say a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and we forget the fourth estate, the role of the media, then we have no democracy. If you don't have the fourth estate, if you don't have an independent media, then we're done. And then when you think about all the major public policy debates we've had over the last few years, things like the Green New Deal, green jobs, Medicare for all, you see the public opinion polling results, and you see massive support for these things. And then you listen to the media and listen to politicians, and you recognize we have a small minority of people who actually oppose this. It's primarily politicians, they're lobbyists, they're super PACs that support them, and the media outlets that spin those ideas. And so it's really about us, the majority of the population, versus this small oligarchy that has the media as a core component of its ideology.
Yeah, and necessary for its control, because we do still get to vote, which means we could replace everyone in Congress. We could, the House of Representatives is up for election every 2 years. You could literally replace every single one of these people every single time. We don't. We simply don't get involved in a lot of these discussions. And the issue of tax cuts too, and the way they're supposed to stimulate the overall economy, they don't. And one of the things that frustrates me as a historian is that you see the same thing repeated over and over and over again. Coolidge's tax cuts contributed to the Depression. Johnson's tax cuts helped to contribute to the stagflation we ended up with heading into the 1970s and the issues there. Reagan's tax cut crushed our actual wages. Wages have literally, if you adjust for inflation, they've not gone up in 40 years. The taxes on the rich and on corporations are a significant part of the reason for that, because we have changed the incentives and basically incentivized them to do nothing, to stop investing in Americans, to stop creating jobs here, to do as little as possible and still make tons and tons of cash, and then pump it out to the Caymans. So all we're doing is we're handing free money to oligarchs, which they then use to buy politicians who then pass more laws that favor only them and not us. If we are going to be that country, and with that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as the promise was made, then we have to replace these people, and we have to change the laws around contributions in the first place. And I love that you made that point a center to your discussion of this, because if we can't tackle that corruption, nothing else ultimately matters. But at the end of the day, it all has to come down to our message to voters. If we can motivate people to come out. And again, some of that does cost money. I like to joke that, well, it's not really joking, but it's a cute comment. People go to Starbucks all the time and buy coffee, right? If you gave $5 a month, like in a recurring $5 a month to progressive politicians running in primaries or in generals, you could replace these people. A few thousand people giving the price of a cup of coffee really adds up. So our small decisions, our choice to vote and our choice to throw that $5 in or whatever we can afford, really is the only way we're ever going to get the policies that would favor ordinary people. If we don't do that, then we are only going to get policies that favor that corporate oligarchy that is currently buying our Congress.
Absolutely.
Okay, so next question is sort of obligatory and it comes with the times. Has this current pandemic influenced the conversation towards modern monetary theory? And do you think coming out of it, we will see progress or retrocession?
Very good question. I wish I can say yes with 100% confidence that we've made a turn in this debate. But I also know that there's so number one, yes, there's a significant attention that people both in government and the media and the general public are paying to MMT and this framework, and that's one of the reasons why we're having these town halls across the country with candidates and so on. But at the same time, there's the pushback from the establishment. A few weeks ago, and I can't remember the exact date, a few weeks ago, there's 60 plus congressmen in DC who issued a statement and saying we can't keep going with additional spending. You've heard what Mitch McConnell and the Republicans are saying about economic relief during the pandemic. We have no money. We're not going to keep doing this. And it's unfortunate that it comes from both Republicans and Democrats. Blue dog Democrats are just as conservative as Republicans when it comes to this. And then you have, I think now we're up to 2 Senate resolutions, U.S. Senate resolutions, explicitly condemning MMT as dangerous for the United States. The first one came May of last year, I believe, and the second one came just a couple weeks ago, I believe. And these are sponsored by primarily, I think, by Republican senators, essentially repeating the same myth about MMT, saying that MMT is dangerous because it will cause inflation. Because it will bankrupt the country, because it will raise interest rates, because of all of these things. And they link this directly to large deficits and large national debt, right? Because MMT promotes additional spending. Well, the national debt has been rising constantly throughout history. The last 10 years in particular, the last 12 years, since 2008, since the financial crisis, we've had massive amounts of deficits, an increasing national debt, and no hint of inflation, right? No hint of interest rates rising. So all of these myths that mainstream economists and politicians repeat about the danger of deficits and the dangers of higher national debt are just that, myths. Case in point, the best example is Japan. Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the developed world since the 1990s, breaking record after record. The last time I checked, it's close to 230 or 240% of debt to GDP. And Japan has been struggling with deflation for the last 3 decades, not inflation, no high interest rates, none of the stuff that mainstream economics has been telling us about the danger of deficits and all of that. So this idea that now they're going to fight MMT with Senate resolutions to scare the public is just a joke, because the public and most people in the economics profession, even those who are not in the MMT space, they know that there is no risk of inflation as we speak, and there is no risk of bankruptcy for the United States. All of these things are myths. So to me, this is a turning point in the economics profession too, not just in politics. This is a paradigm shift, and paradigm shift takes time, and it's not going to be led by the older politicians or the older economists. It's going to be younger people. It's going to be new candidates who come in with new ideas, who are willing to embrace a new vision for the world. So that's what gives me hope. But I don't think we've made that full shift yet. We're kind of in the middle of it as we speak, and we either move fully into a new paradigm politically and in terms of economic thinking, or are we gonna, lose this battle and revert back to the old paradigm? And I think that will be the end of the possibility for a better society. That's going to be, humanity losing the battle against climate change is going to be disastrous.
Yeah, and really, it does keep bringing us back to these points about who is currently in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm encouraged by a lot of this too. I'm encouraged by having more conversations. I'm encouraged by more of this coming out. And really, that helped me to come around to bringing this up much more directly in my own campaign, because it is it is more abstract. If you really start talking about, if you get into the weeds of economics, a lot of voters, they just don't care. They're not interested.
Right.
We do have to talk about things that really do affect us, and good jobs affect us. Creating good jobs, good paying jobs in our area, that's important. And we have a way to do it if we understand how these things all fit together, how these pieces fit together. And I think we do have to have more honest conversations about that. I have loved seeing more mainstream discussion of things like another New Deal. The Green New Deal is tied to clean energy, but as we discussed in our town hall and that very recently, it really is a New Deal overall. It's talking a lot more about housing justice and racial justice and everything else. It's about ultimately fixing the foundations of our economy. And this is a significant part of that overall discussion. People also are talking a lot more about basic income, which was constantly discussed. It was a mainstream proposal. You go back into the 1960s and it had disappeared. In the 60s and 70s, we used to talk a lot more about how we could use this to fundamentally end poverty. And I think that's really, at the end of the day, the biggest single reason for us to both to push these kind of issues, but also to have some kind of hope of understanding it. Because as poverty has been going up, the responsibility to tackle it is appearing to a lot more people as important, as worth discussing again. And if we can help people to understand that the economy is not the stock market and how many people have jobs, like the job creation numbers alone. Those two are not the economy, but it seems to be all the media or the politicians want to talk about. You can produce as many low-paying crap jobs as you want, and it's only going to drag the economy down. Hey, medieval peasants were all employed. They had full employment there. Did they have a great economy? Not really. What we need are good jobs and high pay to ordinary people, because our spending is the foundation for the economy. If we don't have money in our pockets, we're not going to those small businesses and buying what they have to sell. They end up shutting down. What we have is essentially a parasitical class of massive corporations that are happy to undermine ordinary people's spending power and undermine all of those small businesses, all to chase the short-term profit for their shareholders. It's deeply destructive. And if we can't tackle that, we have real problems going forward.
All right. So, the next question plays off of the phrase, how did the cat get so fat? The question is how did the federal debt get so large? And can MMT somehow curb that realistically?
Well, there's a serious problem with the actual name that we use for the federal government debt, the national debt, because it sounds like my debt to the bank. It sounds like the city's debt to Wall Street, but it's not. So going back to what we discussed a little bit ago, which is MMT making a distinction between federal government spending and finances versus the rest of us, the issuer of the dollar versus the users of the dollar. So in order for the federal government to operate, in order for the economy to function, the dollar, which is the monopoly of the United States federal government, has to come from somewhere. So the government has to spend it into existence, into the economy, for the rest of us to use those dollars for buying and selling, borrowing and lending to each other. So if the government spends $1,000 into the economy and then decides to balance its budget, it has to tax $1,000 out. Then the rest of us in the economy are left with nothing. So it's only natural for the federal government to spend $1,000 and only tax $200. so that the remaining $800 are available for the rest of us to use to buy and sell stuff from each other, to lend and borrow from each other. Otherwise, we have no money to function. So it turns out that that deficit of $800 is exactly equal to the surplus that the rest of us have to share. It doesn't mean we share it equally. It could be that most of it goes to the powerful, rich and powerful. And that's a separate question of distribution, of who gets what. But from the budget deficit perspective of the government, it's a surplus of the non-government sector, the rest of us. So that's year one, let's say. And if the government does that every year it spends 1,000 and only taxes 200, like 20% tax rate, let's say. So every year it's putting $800 into the economy and it's not taking it back. So year after year after year, we add up all of those deficits, and that large number is what we call the national debt. So the national debt is simply the summation of all the previous deficits minus the very few surpluses that we had in US history. That gives us that large number, which is the national debt. And because the national debt is the summation of all of those individual annual deficits, remember, those annual deficits are the surpluses of us, the private sector. So the national debt, the sum total, is the sum total of all the net wealth that we've accumulated in the private sector, in the non-government sector. So it's not the same thing as my debt to my bank. It doesn't operate the same way. My debt to my bank is a serious problem. I have to work hard and pay it off eventually. Otherwise, I'm in trouble. The federal government doesn't have to pay off its national debt in the same way I have to pay off my debt to my credit card or to my bank. So the label debt is misleading, and it's intended to provide that scary notion that this is unsustainable, that we're going to go broke, which means we have to reduce our spending. We have to tax more and spend less to balance the books and to operate responsibly, which is nonsense from the federal government perspective. I'll give you a little bit of history. There was, I think, 6 times in US history where Congress intentionally decided to actually pay off the national debt, like literally reduce the national debt. Most politicians today talk about reducing the national debts, but they actually don't. They know they can't and they shouldn't. Because we've learned from history. We've learned from those 6 times in US history where we actually tried to reduce the national debt. Every single time the US government did that, it was immediately followed by a Great Depression. Literally a Great Depression, not a small recession. The last time in US history we actually paid down the national debt was 1929, the Great Crash. So that was part of the lead to the Great Depression. So we've learned our lesson since then. We shouldn't pay off the national debt. We shouldn't even try to come close to reducing the national debt. So what you do when you pay off the national debt, you literally extract all of that wealth that's been circulating in the private sector. You take it away and destroy it. What good does that do to the economy? What good does that do to anybody? That's literally how you create a Great Depression. And I'll close with one quote from Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank for a long time, and not necessarily an MMT advocate or a friend of mine. When he was asked about the danger of the national debt, and he was asked, and he was testifying before Congress, he was asked, that the federal government should try to pay off the national debt. He said, if you do that, if you pay off the national debt, you might as well shut down the Fed, because we'll have no tools to fix this Great Depression that you're going to create. The Federal Reserve Bank operates on a daily basis by buying and selling bonds. They're called open market operations, federal government, US Treasury bonds, in order to stabilize interest rates, in order to manage the quantity of money in the system, in order to manage economic activity and stabilize financial markets and stabilize prices and so on. That's a key policy tool. It's US government bonds, AAA rated, guaranteed never to default, and so on. So Greenspan was essentially saying, if you pay off the national debt, you're going to take away that one most powerful tool that we have at the Federal Reserve Bank to stabilize the financial system. So if you take away that tool, might as well shut us down and you deal with it and see how you can fix a Great Depression. So we have to recognize that this thing we call the national debt is not the same thing as my personal debt or as the state debt or as the city's debt, right? Those are real financial burdens, but the federal government doesn't operate in the same way. And as we're speaking about this, and Liam, you mentioned Stephanie Kelton earlier, a great book to read right now. It's called Stephanie Kelton's book. It came out just a couple of weeks ago. It's called The Deficit Myth, and it's in the top 10 or top 20 list of the New York Times best-selling books. So check it out. It's called The Deficit Myth.
And easily in terms of its accessibility, easily the best of the 3 books that I've read on this thing, because I mean, most of them expect you to know a lot more about economics to begin with, so they're already pitching themselves at a specialist audience. This is written in a way that I think anyone can follow the basic arguments in it. So definitely recommend it there. In terms of this, the debt, really, I'm reminded of a comment that Barack Obama had made about us living off of a credit card. And politicians often talk about how we're basically shifting debt onto our children, or they give these large numbers. So every single person in America owes $57,000, or they come up with, and they're like, oh my God, that would hurt me so much. And we're thinking of it as if it's ours, and it's not. It honestly has nothing to do with us. In many ways, the national debt it's a spook. It's not a real thing. And the name itself is a misnomer. It puts us in the wrong mental framework. We're thinking of it in the wrong way. But it really gets to why I was so nervous about talking about issues like this in a campaign, because people don't in politics usually want a lot of detail. They're used to hearing certain phrases, and those phrases really, they sink in. And national debt is a nice, simple idea we can all wrap our brains around. We all understand what it's like to be in debt. And you think, oh, the country's in debt. We're borrowing from China. China owes us. If they decide to cash in, we're all in trouble. That's not how it works. Right. The national debt is literally the U.S. printing treasury bills. And it can keep doing that as long as we still have a functioning real economy. And thinking that we, again, you hit the history part, like you hit the nail on the head there perfectly. You basically, that's what I would point back to. Every time we've tried to go after this, we've caused problems. I mean, just making progress on it, moving into surplus, what Clinton did, you end up with a recession out of that. I mean, if you literally pay it off completely, we'd have been screwed, really. It's not good for us, but we think of it in the wrong way. We're used to thinking, if I pay off my debt, I'm better off. Mm-hmm. It's not how the federal government works. It's a completely different framework we need.
Yeah, and Liam, if I may, because I'm not watching the comments on social media, but I'm assuming at some point somebody will jump in and say, well, look how well that worked for Zimbabwe or Venezuela or whatever. So let me hit this point really quickly. There's a huge difference between the US national debt, the Japanese national debt, the Canadian, the Australian, the British national debt versus the national debt of developing countries like Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Egypt. And what we're talking about here, because our focus is the US in this particular discussion today, but I really have to, draw the comparison here and the difference. The entire US national debt stock is denominated in US dollars. US federal government currency, which the federal government can issue at any time. So there is zero risk of insolvency. The same is true for the Japanese national debt, and it's much larger than the US national debt, by the way, and they have no inflation and no bankruptcy, because the entire debt of Japan is denominated in Japanese yen. Same thing for Canada, the same thing for the UK, and so on. But when it comes to developing countries who get into trouble with inflation and hyperinflation, it turns out that they have two components of their national debt. A small portion that's usually in the national currency, which they can print and they can always meet those debt commitments. But a huge portion of their debt is what we call external debt. That is debt denominated in dollars and euros and Japanese yen and British pounds, which those countries cannot print into existence. They have to earn them, which means they have to have a strong economy that generates a massive amount of surplus of exports or revenues from tourism or whatever to actually pay that debt. So in the US, we say we have full monetary sovereignty, the same as Japan, the same. So MMT is, in the context of our discussion today, everything we've talked about applies in the case of the US, Canada, and Japan. But also MMT has policy solutions for developing countries in terms of how to reclaim or regain their monetary sovereignty, which I will not discuss today, but I'm happy to point people to resources.
And a fascinating discussion, given that much of the developing world does have to somehow get out from under the, well, realistically, the boot of the former imperial powers, because they do still control so much of the economy. I mean, so much of the debt of West African countries is in francs, and now like pegged into the euro there, because they had taken out tons of debt from the former colonial occupier. And those are a long-term problem for a lot of countries. We don't have that issue at all. Another one that I often see people on the right bringing up, attacking this, is they'll point to Greece. And they'll really point to a number of Mediterranean countries now that have overspent, they've taken in massive debt. And the problem there is the euro, because the euro is not under the control of Greece. They can't print drachmas anymore to bail themselves out. I mean, it's the Italians can't print more lira anymore to deal with their problems. They're stuck with the euro. And the issue there is that the budgets in Europe are not all working together. They don't have a complete fiscal union. They only have monetary union. So it actually, in some ways, harms those countries, even if as it gives certain benefits. And when people started talking about that monetary union, it was part of a broader project of European unity, eventually aimed at a kind of United States of Europe, which would have the linked together budgets, which then could avoid all the problems. It would make Europe work the same way that the US does, or Japan or Canada, that are monetary sovereigns. Right now, Greece is not a monetary sovereign, but it's also not fully linked in with the rest of Europe, which means it cannot deal with those problems in the same way. So it's a lot of that classic apples and oranges sort of comparison. It makes no sense to talk about these countries and connect them to us. They're completely different issues.
Yeah, Greece is the equivalent of the state of California. It doesn't have monetary sovereignty, right? It has to balance its books. It has to tax in order to spend. So there's no comparison there with the U.S. federal government.
Which is perfect. Actually, I can bring in a couple of points here for Liz, since she's not able to join us today, running for the state assembly here. How would this really affect us in California? California is not a monetary sovereign. Anything we take out in debt, we're stuck paying off at some point. The problem here that I point to, and one of the ways that MMT can help in the context of California, is that California already pays in more into the federal budget than it gets back out. And it does have to tax people at too high a rate in some ways, because it's limited in what it can apply in terms of property taxes to big corporations. I mean, Disneyland is basically paying the same taxes they had in the 1970s, which makes no sense at all. They can clearly afford to pay more. And we're sort of stuck in a way. If we use federal policy to stimulate growth in the real economy again, if we can realign federal policy, the state of California would be able to lower some of the tax burden on us, which would, definitely make things easier for people living in California, for our cost of living. I mean, our state is stuck charging us more in taxes to pay off its debt. Federal policy can't affect that. We can actually directly stimulate growth in California. We can do things that raise Californians' wages. We can do things that inject more cash into the California economy. And that would allow the state to change its policies and stop going farther into debt.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are certain things you can do at the local level, at the city and state level, but certainly not the same amount of policy transformation that the federal government can bring with the Green New Deal, for example. But one of the most important things local officials should and can do is make it very clear to their constituents what their role as city officials, as state officials, in terms of city finances and state finances operate, and making a clear distinction between that and how the federal government operates. So when it comes to introducing the Green New Deal, the funding comes from the federal government, but the selection of the projects, the implementation, the auditing, the management, all of it is local. So we have certain powers and responsibilities at the local level but then we have to call on the federal government to do its job, to use the power of the purse to finance the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, and so on. In terms of taxing and regulating the abusive power and influence of corporations, states have limited roles, but they do have ways of tackling that. In terms of getting money out of politics, we can do things at the local level too, and help lead the national conversation about corruption and abusive power in the economy. But recognizing that the big change has to come from the federal government.
All right, so you kind of beat me to the final question, which was, how does this affect California? So I guess we move on to final comments. Fadhel, you go first.
So in closing, I mean, I'm hoping that this is, for people who are new to the MMT conversation, that this will be a segue into learning more, engaging more with the approach that MMT brings to public policy, and recognizing that this is a turning point in our history in terms of this paradigm shift that I described earlier. So we have a choice to make. We either jump on board and keep pushing for more democratic, for more prosperous economy and society, which means fighting corruption, which means supporting independent candidates, supporting independent media, to get that transformation, to get 535 people in Congress who are of the people, by the people, for the people, not of the super PACs, by the super PACs. And this is where individual contributions and efforts, and whichever way we can contribute, some can contribute money, some can do text banking and phone banking, some can contribute by educating their parents and their neighbors and their friends that we, the people, have the power to transform the system and take back the democratic process. And if we don't, then that's what the super PACs are counting on. They're counting on us not to care. They're counting on us not to get involved, not to vote, because they know deep down that they're the minority and we're the majority. So the only way they win is by getting as many people from the working class as possible not to care, not to vote, not to get involved. And the media guarantees that they're brainwashed into scaring the population about the national debt, right? Because this is what they say. All of these ambitious programs are going to explode the national debt, and then you have to pay for it, right? And what we're saying is call their bluff. Say, we can afford all of these things, and we're going to tax and regulate their market power out of existence, and we're going to democratize Congress and bring back a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So those of you in California, if Liam is running in your district, absolutely support his campaign and do whatever you can to send him to Washington, D.C. We didn't talk about the incumbent today, so if I may, look him up. What has he done for you in the last, 2 decades plus? When was the last time you've seen him in a town hall? When was the last time did he reach out to you and ask, what do you think we should do about green jobs? What do you think? And ask yourself, is this person representing me? And then do a little bit of research and identify who are the contributors to that particular campaign. Who does he hang out with? Who does he vote with? When was the last time you've seen him on TV, nationally or locally, speaking to the people, engaging with the people? And if you think that's democratic representation, then we're in trouble, right? So to me, it's a no-brainer. You need change in that particular district, and Liam's campaign has the firepower, has the energy, has the commitment, has the integrity to bring that democratic process to you. And if you're not in this district in California, if you're somewhere else in this country, ask yourself the same questions about who's representing you. And if there's no progressive candidate running in your district, then you should get together with your friends and figure out who's going to run to unseat that particular person.
Thank you so much, Fadhel. Liam, final thoughts?
Yeah, if we're going to throw the incumbent into this is Ken's 28th year. And what has he done to make life better for people out here? He is funded 98% by corporations. They are his real constituents. We are his suckers. And we need to actually learn to look into these things a little bit, to think about how this really affects us, and to think about whether or not these people are actually representing us at all. His title is representative. Does he show up and answer your questions? No. His office staff will hang up on people who challenge him on issues. He does not answer emails, social media. It's always just fluff. If he speaks, it's a tightly scripted issue that he's trying to use to fearmonger things. And one point I like to try and make to people, because it's such a historical truism, if someone is out there trying to get you to hate on someone else, think about how they stand to benefit by you doing so. I mean, when Calvert gets out there and fearmongers against immigration and encourages his people to get riled up about asylum seekers, think about what he gets from that. It's all about distracting you while he has his hand in the cookie jar, taking everything and handing it to those corporate owners. That ultimately is the problem. We have to replace the power elite who's benefiting from this system, and we have to put in people who are not ducking in to that same corrupt cookie jar full of corporate cash. Because as soon as you do that, that's who you are working for, not the actual people. So we do need to start pushing things around. And again, you guys know, like, it's easy enough to like work with my campaign and phone banking and text banking from anywhere there. If you can afford to throw in a little cash, even those little bits really do add up. This is how we do it. If we can afford to reach enough voters and to talk about them. And one of the things that I try to do a lot in this campaign is I'm not going to talk down to people. I'm willing to address any of these complex issues. If you guys want to get into the weeds and talk about economic history, okay. But I really want you to think about something else instead. Think about your own life. Is it better? Has it been improving? My generation, the Generation X, is the first one in American history not to do better than its parents' generation. Every single time life got better for people. And when people now say like, oh, we pulled ourselves up by the bootstrap. No, there were so many incentives in the economy working to make things easier for the boomer generation. And those were pulled away. The incentives were all changed. And that had a direct impact on our economic potential, like what we could achieve. And my generation is better off than the millennials who followed me. And the millennials are better off than Generation Z that are coming up now. We are screwing American people because we are not following policies that actually help us and help the real economy. There's a reason that so many people are stuck living at home. It's not that millennials are lazy and entitled. It's because they don't make as much money as they should, and the rent is too damn high. We have the ability to fix this, but it involves putting in an uncorrupt Congress and actually following the data to pass good public policy. So there's my little pitch for supporting Liam O'Meara for Congress, as well as Liz Lavertu and Kate Schwartz, our assembly candidates here. You know, put in good people who are not going to parrot the same lines here and are actually going to work for you.
All right, thank you very much, Liam. And that does it for our show today. I want to thank our guests very much, Liam and Fadhel. Thank you for joining us. Join us next Saturday, August 1st, with Alfred Tu and Tisa Rodriguez talking about modernizing American infrastructure and how the Inland Empire can benefit from that. It's going to be a really interesting show. Thank you, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.